We're live now, Steve.
It is a jovial Christmas holiday month of December, and I am Steve Foster, part of the African American Lawyers section, along with some very attentive and willing law enforcement participants from across the state of Texas. Also joined by our chair of the African American Lawyers section, Rudy Mateer, and Kevin Lawrence, the executive director of TMPA. We also welcome in Doug Griffith down in Houston with the Houston Peace Officers Association, Travis Hammond as well, one of the directors, members, I believe, first vice presidents of TMPA, and the iPhone, is that Clay?
That is
That's
Clay.
me.
Clay Taylor, DPSOA. And one of the things we want to really highlight is the fact that as people were trying to figure out the civil unrest and what media has presumed of a clashing of ethnicities in the United States, we wanted to use the experience and skill sets and relationships we have amongst each other to come together to look for solutions, to disseminate information, and also find a way, as the upcoming session starts in January, to weed, sift, and get through a lot of topics that we look to present to lawmakers. And we thank all the lawmakers and their staffs for jumping on, or at least looking back at past recordings that we have. With that, I'd like to continue with last week and pick up the topic that the foundation, as I want to call it, the Texas Black Caucus Foundation, has recently named Pflugerville Councilman and our chair of our section, Rudy Mateer, as president and executive director. They've also elected a board, raise funds to kickstart programs, and begin working on a comprehensive research agenda to assist policymakers in the 2021 legislative session. So I think all this is on time. I also want to harken back because Kevin and I have known each other back since the 2001 session. Rudy and I also go back to the Capitol. So when we recognize legislative process and session, and this one is going to be very different because I already know that the processes of the COVID environment will have things be very different because you cannot congregate. One of the things, though, that Rudy did way back was have conversations with me. And I was very happy to see that there were others coming along in the pipeline to be able to continue on this service. And now he's in the particular spot that he is. And I don't think that that is by happenstance. One of the things, though, that when we have come together, I think that a lot of us find out that there are things that, one, exist that are helpful, and two, kind of when I saw Rudy, that we didn't know as young Black men how the perspective of the legislative process and the people we were working with, how that interaction really went. Let me give you a quick example. I had a classmate who worked with me in the Capitol in DC. Pete Hadrovic played basketball somewhere between 6'7" and 6'9". And he said, you know what? He says, these Capitol buildings were built in the 1800s. And you know, I have to always duck my head when I go in to meetings. Well, I don't think any of us have to concern ourselves or think about having to duck our heads walking into a room because we're not 6'8", 6'9". Well, a lot of the things that we have addressed so far over the months in 2020, I think a lot of us as differing groups have not thought about per se, that some things are already there to help us and assist us, and then some are giving us different perspectives. So with that, I will ask the president and executive director of the Legislative Black Caucus Foundation to kind of give us just an overview of what has been asked of you. You have a board, and how we as a group, all of us, can help assist you as well in your position in the upcoming legislative session.
Well, you know,
it's fun that you said that you remember being at the Capitol. I remember being there asking questions and just learning the
I had
process.
to make sure you had to eat too, Rudy, because
Yeah.
the young guys don't get the good food.
But that's not the first time we met. So we met back in 2004 when I was in law school. Whenever a friend of mine, Jennifer Henry, sent me over to your office to go ahead and learn it, because she was like, "Hey, there's this guy. You can work out with him early in the morning. He gets up early like you. So why don't you go ahead and start working out with him and go lifting weights from there as well?" And that's how we met. And and you start to learn all the different engagements with that. But with that, what you're saying though is exactly right regarding the pipeline and understanding and seeing that people don't know what they don't know, right? You're just learning and trying to get through things. Back then, we were dealing with the Hopwood decision had just been overturned by Grutter and Gratz. We were trying to figure out things to help diversify things over at the university. Law school. We just had the egg of the MLK statue, blackface parties, and everything else as well. So to have someone like yourself in the community, and Kevin, you before we went live, we started talking about Senator West and how I call him Royce. He was one of the people. Royce, Rodney Ellis, Sylvester Turner. I'm trying to think of who else. Mrs. T, Sonia Thompson. I mean, those people, they would come. I mean, Chief Justice Wallace Jefferson. They would come to the school, check on us, ask us what we needed, and try to honestly educate us. We're just kids. Like, we're just trying to learn the law. We're trying to understand our path, what we can do to make difference. Cool. We got a JD. What can you do with that? How can you advocate for people? How do you learn to work with people and everything else there? And that's the coolest thing about being, I'll just be frank with you. That's one of the coolest things about being part of this foundation is that I'm able to help honor and support the people who have been doing a lot of work, a lot of efforts that paved the path for where I am today. An additional part, which I think, I mean, I'll be frank, which is really, really what made this different for me was having the over 300 ministers across the state, who are in lockstep with us regarding the work and support to make sure that they understand that when you're talking about Black Texans and support and rise to make sure equity and support for those measures, that benefits not just Black Texans, but Texas, all Texans, because people want to see people do well. They want to see people have an equitable stance and an opportunity to succeed. And I think that in all sincerity, particularly the white evangelical ministers they're the ones who've been missing on these front lines for a long period of time. And it was amazing to see the outpouring and support from them saying, hey, listen, we want to support and see what we can do to make a difference on these issues, because we know these issues aren't just affecting the Black community, it affects all of us, all Texans, all Americans with that. And,
Hey, Rudy,
go ahead.
can you also, as you move forward, let those ministers and the folks you interface with, let them know that there has been eager participation by TMPA, DPSOA, Houston Police Officers Association, because I don't think, that gets brought up again.
Oh, wait. Okay. I'm going to stop you, counselor. What do you think was one of my biggest things I taught them about what was going on as we speak? Hey, listen.
No, I was going to finish the sentence and say, not because Kevin said it, but because you said it to the group. There's a difference. There's a difference to me when I think white Americans say things to white America about atrocities. There is a difference when the message comes from a different messenger. And that's one of the great things of having the collaboration, because you don't hear it just, oh, well, that's just the Black people saying this for Black people. No, it's just the law enforcement saying this about the law enforcement. We have crossed in and crossed over in looking at a solution that is embraced by all.
Yeah, and I what I did was I encouraged not only my board members but the pastors, the caucus and other folks to come look at the videos. And I said, hey, we're doing this once a week. And I said specifically, Steve Foster, Nikki Creakston, Green, these are the people that help bring us together. I said, Kevin Lawrence, Doug, Travis, getting the folks over there as well across the state right there. That made a difference in how we approach the issue, because we said, wait a minute, you can't address these issues by staying in silos from each other.
Right.
You got to talk and embrace and work from this. Well, and let's be frank, this is one of the few places where you're seeing this being done publicly with that. And as Kevin said, there are going to be times when we disagree on things, but you don't have to be disagreeable while doing that. You can go ahead and work and understand that. And there are a lot of education points that go with it too, as well. I think that, another thing that's really important is that, I always say this, the activist community is on the other, as the same coin, the other side of the coin with the policymakers. Because I think that if you don't have people saying, hey, this is what we need over here, right there, speaking out on the streets about this, you're not going to have the policymakers actually listening, trying to infect and see what change about these things. And what, from our standpoint, we're nonpartisan. We're 501c3, we're willing to work with all sides. I mean, as you know, the Black Caucus is, it has Republicans and Democrats in it too, as well. And that resonates with people because it's like, hey, listen, let's have a place, a safe harbor, a possibility where these ideas and these concepts can meet with it. Our 3E fund, we're talking about empowerment, engagement, and we're talking about education. Those are the pillars that we stand on. And for us, when we're looking at what we're doing regarding this session, we're looking at, hey, listen, yes, we're going to look at what systemic changes. We're going to look at what's going on with social justice, criminal justice system. As Kevin's already met with Senator West about. We're going to look at, honestly, the Center for Disproportionality and Disparate Treatment, because we're talking about the pandemic. Make no mistake. I know we talked about this last time. A lot of the issues, a lot of the just the anger, the strength, and the turmoil that you're seeing, this is tied to people losing their jobs as well. This is tied to people who have been disproportionately affected and have had seen loved ones die or be extremely sick because of the pandemic. This is all convoluted solutions with that as well. And at Health and Human Services in the state of Texas, you had a department that looked at disparate treatments when it came to health outcomes for Black and Brown people across the state. It was actually such a model. You had people from across the country calling, asking questions and trying to figure out how to do it. And it was crazy concept based on data. And it was one of the key things that we had going on with this state, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And unfortunately, it didn't get the funding it needed a couple of sessions ago. So it's been interesting to see the media and other folks come up and say, why don't we create a center where we can actually discover these issues and try to be proactive on these things? And then someone was like, well, it existed. So why don't we go ahead and look at refunding that and work on these other things? Additionally speaking too, when we're talking about workforce development, we need to go ahead and make sure there was a Department of Labor article that came out in the Wall Street Journal last week that specifically said that if you're a Black person in this country, you've been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and by COVID-19 regarding the recession, to the point where if you have a college degree, you need that college degree just to be able to get the same job as a white counterpart who would have an associate's degree or a high school degree. And that if people don't have the ability to go ahead and be employed because they're being underemployed, well, that exasperates what we have with our safety net systems, right? And so we're looking at workforce training, we're looking at loss of income, you're looking at all these, you're looking at healthcare, all these safety nets that we have there. Well, if we don't want to overburden those venues, those opportunities, we need to make sure that we're actually supporting people to get the job training, get the jobs that they can get with that. Same thing goes with education. Unfortunately, we all know this, is that you're about to lose a significant portion of our population because they're being lost learning from home. They're being lost in this pandemic, being lost in what's happening when it comes to this, learning. And what do we do to capture these kids back up with their counterparts to make sure they don't get lost in the system when it comes to education? And those are the focus areas that we're looking at. We're looking at what are we doing in the criminal justice system? What are you doing with healthcare? What are you doing with workforce? What are you doing with education? And those issues are going to be key to see what we can do about that. And in all sincerity, these issues touch on law enforcement. All of them touch on law enforcement because all the different aspects that exasperate the system that we put for law enforcement to clean up the messes in society. Because again, I'll reiterate again, I don't know if any other policymakers are scared to say this, but it's true. We failed as policymakers to go ahead and have true proactive changes in our systems to be preventative, to not just say, oh, by the way, Kevin, yeah, we've got this person. Yeah, we've known he's been a psychotherapist for years, but we don't really have something in place for him. Why don't you go pick him up? Why don't you go take care of that right there as well? You know what? Yeah, we have this person, drug abuse system, et cetera, right there as well. But you know what? It costs money to be able to take care of that right there and give those families. Doug, why don't you go take care of that person? And it's kind of like, what are we doing? What do we do? We're adding on the duties and obligations to law enforcement as opposed to trying to pare down and actually true. Fred, that reverberates in my mind when Fred mentioned that several weeks ago. The first thing that goes when you cut funding is community policing. And I said, hey, listen, we still need to make it a focal point with that. But at the same time, I get what he's saying is that what law enforcement's focus is, the central focus is, if you're not allowing for that to happen, if you're not having the funding, if you're not having the training for that, well, then guess what? It erodes everything else that goes on from that as well. And that's where these kind of conversations and things that we've been having for the last wow, I mean, what, since June, July now? These conversations, I mean, that's where it makes a difference.
Rudy, you said one thing when you were talking about your focus that I think is a direct crossover. You said the words job training. And I think that's where Doug and Kevin and Travis and Clay have talked about training is one of the first things that goes when you don't have proper funding. And, I want to bleed this over into something that when we think it's appropriate to talk about the differences, because job training for law enforcement, they're professionals. And Kevin, I've heard you speak about the difference in how the media has blended law enforcement scenarios with civilian scenarios in our country. And you can't have them all blended into one situation and say, why did George Zimmerman do this? George Zimmerman is not law enforcement. George Zimmerman doesn't have the job training that Doug Griffith has. It's a completely, just because there's black and white people doesn't mean it's the same issue. Doesn't mean it comes under the same guise or in the same column of discussion. But I know, Kevin, you and I, we talk about this ad nauseum, how it just seems like black and white issues of conflict just get put in one pot. You can't generalize the things that we've looked at and found solutions for and disseminated information when it comes to law enforcement versus the civilian actions of others in our country.
And I'd like to kind of also mention there, it's, a lot of people, most people who are not in law enforcement, have never been in law enforcement, don't really understand all the different functions of law enforcement. Rudy makes an excellent point. We have heaped more and more and more responsibilities on law enforcement that probably are not law enforcement functions or should not be law enforcement functions, but they really don't have a cubbyhole anywhere else in our governmental systems, so they get thrown at law enforcement. So when you start looking at law enforcement, you have to stop and think, okay, which part of law enforcement are we going to discuss today? Are we going to talk about law enforcement as primarily an entity that is responsible for investigating crimes after they've been committed and then trying to, give all the information, the facts to the prosecutor's offices so those criminals can be prosecuted after the fact? Or are we looking at law enforcement as a crime suppression tool? In other words, we're trying to stop crimes as they are occurring. Are we're out there, proactively trying to put a stop to, robberies and rapes and murders and so on and so forth? Or are we looking more at crime prevention? Trying to provide our citizens with the tools to, protect themselves, to prevent themselves from being victimized, trying to retrain people that may have started down the wrong path so that we can prevent recidivism among people that have gotten into criminal behaviors, and hopefully we can get them out of the criminal. Or are we talking more about community involvement, which part of law enforcement are we talking about at any given moment has a huge bearing on what we're talking about. So when you start talking about cutting resources, you need to understand you're going to trim off crime prevention, crime suppression, criminal investigations, community services. Which part is it? And I think the point Frederick was making was the first thing we cut is training in all of those areas. So now we're asking people to do a job that they're not properly trained to do. And so anyway, I just want to make sure that as we talk about this, we need to understand we're talking about your comment about the building wasn't made for somebody who's 6'9". Well, people who aren't in law enforcement don't understand the size of the doorways in the police station either.
Oh, and it's very important because Fred, I think that was such an important point that we need to move through the discussion, because when you look at, talking about bias training or what de-escalation and things of that nature, I think one of the first things is, and I was talking to a young lady in North Carolina yesterday, just having a discussion, because other people are talking about these things, is that you have to have some type of interaction and relation. And we've said this before any type of possible escalation occurs. And if we don't get to the training of that and get to the real essence of what we want our law enforcement to provide, because I think you're right, Kevin, it's like the old school and now it's being brought back, life cereal commercials, but hey, let's give it to Mikey. He'll like it. Well, you just can't give all these extraneous duties to law enforcement without training. They have to get their own continuing education that's not paid for, and there's no uniformity throughout 2,700 agencies in the great state of Texas. That to me sounds like failure before we even start.
So Steve, I wasn't laughing at what you, that's an excellent point. I laughed that you made a reference from the 1970s and you thought it was relevant right now.
No, because no. They have the new life commercials, cereal commercials. Mikey's actually a little girl now. So if you don't remember the original ones, you think Mikey is a girl, but it was brought back. And again, I think a lot of these issues and the information we found out, gentlemen, it's been there. We just didn't see it maybe when it was initially brought to light, and nobody has really brought it to the forefront that we're citizens, lawmakers, staff, law enforcement, lawyers, the whole ball of wax hasn't recognized the work that's been done. We bring up a fact that now Massachusetts is finally coming around to having a certification that we've had for 50 years. No one knows these things, Rudy, because we just go along and speed through things, pass things, throw them to the side to say, that was a great bill for 2021. That was a great bill for 2019. But heck, we had it in 2005.
So let me build on that. So what you said is interesting is that, and I remember when Doug, one meeting, showed us, I guess, the manual, and it was like one volume of, 100 ones over there with them, just how thick it was, and, how they didn't know everything specific with it. And then talked about, it goes to your point, we develop things for a specific situation. We feel like, oh, that's been addressed. We can go put that on the shelf. We're done with it. Right. As opposed to actually using the application and applying that moving forward and trying to do things with it as well. And I encourage folks who are watching right now to go back and watch that episode. I wish I knew the date where Fred was talking about, when Nikki was talking about the report, Fred was like, wait a minute, I was part of that report. I've never even seen that was published. You got this right here as well. How come I'm just seeing this for the first time ever? This should have been well known to everybody. This is what we discovered and what we looked at. And it was like 4 or 5 years ago, whenever that was actually done with that. And I'm very concerned with, in general, what's going on in our society with people doing things for cheap political theater and cheap tricks without having true systemic, pragmatic methods, ideas, concept, concrete reasons, solutions to do stuff. It's like you're running for this to be class president, and you're saying free pizza parties on Fridays, and we'll have ice cream, on Mondays or something like that as well. I mean, we've got to be. These are serious issues. And I get so concerned that we do such a disservice for the folks that we serve, for people I serve, for the board that I serve, that we do things for cheap theatrics, as opposed to saying, no, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Let's try to solve this. Let's try to work on something like this as well. We're not trying to make cheap political points. We're trying to make lives and work on things and make a big difference on these things, these issues. And
it seems like our process is set up for a quick South Beach or an Atkins diet. So you can lose 10, 15 pounds and everybody's good. where we actually need a lifestyle change of not eating sweets after 8 o'clock each evening. When you can create a lifestyle change in the society, it gets picked up and it's a constant. It's not a stopgap measure to make us feel better because someone was injured in an incident that media rose to the 5, 6, and the 10 that evening. And then we move on to the next time, and then we throw it up again on the 5, 6, and the 10. It's like jumping on all you see people that get on all these different diets. They don't lose the weight. They kind of cycle, lose 10, gain some, but the person that can stay fit has a constant and a consistent lifestyle change. We have the things in place, but we don't know how to grasp on the things that we've done to create a consistency and have a societal change that interacts different groups of people in a way that one can take some burden off of law enforcement, get them to the training that would be helpful in the current and present day, and inform the community that we have these resources that just have not been applied to create that consistency.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're looking at true systemic change. I mean, that's in the TXBC Foundation. That's what we're talking about. That's what all our partners are looking at. We're, you know, we're looking at true systemic change, and we've got a partner again from the religious community, from the tech community, Tyson Tuttle, you know, the legislatures, the Black Caucus themselves, and honestly, we're looking at partners like yourselves and everybody else to go ahead and talk about these issues to make true systemic change on them. We're not always going to agree on things, but we've got to talk about these things, and we've got to find viable solutions to issues that people honestly have been kicking the can down the road for a long time. And I'm proud that, you know, we just met with the United Way the other day to talk about, hey, early childhood development and how that goes down the line for businesses. If you're not taking care of these kids, if you're not getting the food, nutrition, the education early on, well, guess what? You know, by third grade, we see what happens with these studies. And you're going to talk about education, workforce training, all these things. You're falling behind. So what are we doing? Because these kids are being treated disproportionately from that as well. And then what's going on in the actual healthcare systems or the education systems to support these families? Because, you know, many of the people that are getting affected, it's not because the parents don't care. It's because the parents are working 2 or 3 jobs just trying to make it ends meet. So what are we doing? You know, in Pflugerville, one of the things I was really proud of our school district working with our workforce development board is to create a redevelopment site, retraining site at the evenings for parents. So they can go ahead and get new skill sets, good ideas in places like plumbing, electricians, and other things right there as well. That frankly, if you look at those things, we're running out of people in those industries. Those are necessary industries. And then if you look at, you know, Texas 2036 and these other organizations, when they're talking about the skill sets necessary for Texans in the year 2036, only less than 20% of Texans actually have those skill sets right now. So what are we doing to prepare for those things, prepare for those jobs in the futures? And, you know, I don't see, I mean, I know Steve and I, we've talked about this anecdotally. You don't see a lot of crime, you don't see a lot of mayhem, you don't see a lot of stuff. When you see people who are well-educated, are able to take care of their families, and able to go ahead and support and do the things they deserve, take care of their rent and everything else. When you have a good job, you're able to support your families and everything else as well, a lot of those other things go out the wayside. But when you're having food deserts, when you're having a lack of education, when you're having a lack of healthcare right there as well, you don't know what you're going to do, how you're going to do those things. If we don't take care of those base issues and work with folks on those things, then we're in trouble. And that's where, crazy concept, I think everyone agrees with that. So then why don't we start with that and see how we get there? It's all we need to do. Start with that basic technology. Doug, I'd love to hear from you.
No, that's, and I said this on one of the very first episodes we had of this. It's not necessarily a black and white issue when it comes to jobs and all this other stuff. In every single poor neighborhood, it doesn't matter if it's a white. I grew up in Cloverleaf on the east end of Houston. That was just dirt poor. It looks like a freaking third world country over there. It's predominantly white. Banditos controlled everything. I worked Sunnyside my entire career, African American. Same freaking issues because there's economically depressed areas. And it doesn't matter if you're black or white. If you don't have access to a good education, if you don't have access to a good job, then what do you have left? You have the streets left, and there's nothing good for you out there. It's just not. Any officer that works a high crime area will tell you, it doesn't matter if it's white criminals, black criminals, Hispanic criminals, it doesn't matter. It's going to be in an economically depressed area because they have nothing else to do. They don't get a good education. Gangs have taken over our inner city schools. We're not doing enough to stop that. If you can't get a good education, you're not getting a good job. And it just leads down that path to where there's nothing left but the streets for them. And it sucks to watch these kids, very intelligent kids. I knew this drug dealer I put in jail one time. He was a math whiz. He could figure out exactly what he needed to do to get his product out there. Yet he couldn't get a job. If he could be an accountant tomorrow because he was so good with numbers, but he didn't have that opportunity. And that pisses us off as law enforcement officers to see these kids out there and not having what they need to excel.
Where I will disagree with Doug just slightly is that you're right. Being poor is not a black, white, or brown issue. It's an issue. It's not illegal to be poor. I do believe, however, we need to acknowledge that a higher percentage of our minority populations are living below that poverty level. A higher percentage of blacks, a higher percentage of Hispanics. There are reasons for that, which I doubt very seriously are tied to law enforcement, but there are societal reasons that that cause that. And if we're going to deal with the underlying issues, those have to be included. We have to have those conversations as well. Does it impact the way law enforcement deals with those communities? Absolutely. There is no doubt about it. But we have to acknowledge that there is in fact disparate impact on our minority communities simply because there is a higher degree of poverty in our minority communities.
And Kevin, to your point, I want to make sure if everyone is watching, we're going to watch the recording, read the book, The Color of the Law. This is where Steve and I can talk at length about as lawyers right there as well. And it's why, honestly, this is why the African American lawyer section's here, why the state bar is talking about these issues. We as lawyers have played a role in making systemic racism happen in this country, meaning that it's not just like what Kevin said, it's not by happenstance that these things happen. If you have places where you're not allowed people like Levittown, where you're not allowing specific people, communities, black and brown people to live in these neighborhoods, to have these good housing, to take care, just like Doug, what you're saying, have good housing, take care of their families, they're still right there as well. What do you expect is going to happen when you put in places and barriers where you're not allowing for education in certain parts of the city to get school funding right there as well, or to have a healthcare institute, and you put barriers by law, which makes it essentially impossible to be able to do that? Those are real issues that really happen. And those are things that, Kevin, to your point, that's where it's troubling to me that when I hear people say that they feel that when we're talking about implicit bias and all those other things, we're trying to quote unquote blame Whitey and everything else there. It's like, whoa. No. Everyone has implicit bias. Everyone has different viewpoints, ideas, et cetera, right there, happen right there as well. No matter who you are, race, color, creed, ethnicity, that's what happens with that as well. But when you're talking about issues and you're seeing the disproportionality that's affected black and brown people in this country right there as well, it's not just by happenstance, and it's not someone wearing a mustache. You made a reference from the 70s, Steve. I'm trying to think of the guy from, Dastardly, that dog, that guy in the cartoon, Dirk Dastardly, twirling his mustache, ha ha ha, yes, I'm destroying all the black and brown people in this country. No one's doing that. But we got to recognize that, as you said, Steve, when you talked about the Capitol building, the 6'9" person, if you got to realize the systems that were put in place, were not put in place to go ahead and help and support these people, and disproportionately affected black and brown people. And that's what was done. And it was the law that did that. Not law enforcement, not Joe on the street, not these people who are being born right now, et cetera, right there. We set that path. So therefore, it's up to us. We have a responsibility to fix these issues and to work on these issues and honestly educate people. Because when people hear about it, most people never even heard of Levittown. So when they're like, wait, okay, so the 86% of all Americans, they're somewhere around there, how they actually have generational wealth is by the selling and ownership of their homes. But if you're not able to buy a home and you're not allowed to buy a home, well, then how do you transfer that generational wealth? And therefore, consequently, that's why you see a lot of Black and Hispanic people. I mean, even Levittown was 1947, and it's still reverberating today, because if you weren't able to buy that home, you weren't able to transfer that in day to death. You weren't able to give your loved ones, et cetera, right there as well, to keep that wealth to help bring them up so they can take care of their families, take care of their education, and make sure they're able to prosper and work on things as everybody else. You're starting people from the back. And that's stuff where if you look at it, you're like, whoa, that's real? That actually occurred? Most people don't know that. And it further exacerbates everything else that goes on there. No one is out here saying, yes, white people, you owe us this. Nobody's saying that. And it just blows my mind when you hear people, try to articulate that or say something like that as well. What they're trying to do is, hey, listen, there are systemic issues that need to be addressed. Let's talk about them. Let's educate everybody on them. Because once you get educated on it, then you can have a true, honest discussion about the facts and everything else that goes into it.
Well, here's the other thing too, that I think even I kind of somewhat realized a shift. I think most think that law enforcement is the first kind of wave of differences between people in our community. I think, and you brought up a tremendous point, the way that the system has been set up economically and legally, I think everything rolls downhill to law enforcement that is now dealing with those inequities in the community. And then they're just sent in to try to restore law and order, not given the tools. But again, if you can take care of things upstream, the interaction and how law enforcement works with communities that have better opportunities is going to be completely different. Rudy, you and I, even if there is a concern about law enforcement, don't see it the exact same way in a sense as those who are in an economically depressed area and don't have the ability to work with Kevin and Clay and Doug and Travis. That's a completely different scenario of person in the society, because the economics and the education doesn't affect us in an adverse way. We've used it to a positive to create the relationships with the Kevins and Dougs and Travises and Clays so that we can actually come together for a solution. The difference is our first interaction with law enforcement is a positive for a solution. Community and media gets law enforcement on the back end after the economics and those types of legal bars now have run their course, and Doug and his group get sent in because of those disparities. And I think I had never looked at it in that fashion, that they're actually getting the stuff that rolls downhill to them, as opposed to people thinking they're the first guys that are coming in and offending. The offense was way back, like you said, with the laws and the economics, not the law enforcement.
And those young kids out there in Sunnyside, South Park, they don't give a rat's rear end about me, because I can't help them get an education. I can't help them. All I'm there to do is make sure they don't commit crimes. So they're looking at me from a different standpoint. Hey, it's going to take a whole community to step up and help these guys in schools, to help them get a good education, to help them find a good job, to mentor them. I'm going to be on a group deal like this tomorrow with Worthing High School students. It's called Win-Win. And I'm going to be on there doing everything I can. But at the end of the day, I don't live out there. I can't help them in their school other than be a police officer, which is a negative for most of them. So until we get in that and show them the positive atmosphere, it's not going to help.
So Rudy, you said something about the United Way and how they wanted to come together. Is it possible to marry up law enforcement with the United Way with those youth at those early stages so that now your perspective of law enforcement is not the same as it would be, as Doug mentioned, when he has an interface with a Zoom call and you're talking about high school students. Also want to mention that high school is home to, rest in peace, the gentleman, 3-time Super Bowl champ, Cliff Branch, who taught me how to catch a football in my backyard. So Houston Worthing was his high school before he became an Oakland Raider. So
Wow, awesome.
Yeah.
But I mean, but Stephen, you're saying something that I think that we all agree and we've seen, right? Is that you've got to get to people, or you've got to get to the youth early, and you've got to have those positive interactions. You've got to have it like what we say in Pflugerville is that, wait a minute, I know Officer Dan. This is how Officer Dan has been with me. This officer wasn't that way. So that's how I know that that wasn't the way an officer should act. So then they juxtapose and they understand that not all officers act like that other officer, because I know Officer Dan. I know how an officer acts. I know how they respond. This is how they work from there as well. And when you have those positive interactions, I had my daughter, my youngest one, a 7-year-old the other day. It's funny you mentioned this, Steve. I didn't hear what Doug had to say. She said, Daddy, we had the police come to our school. And I said, oh, what did they come to the school about? She goes, they came to the school and they said hi and they let us pet the dog. And they told us that they're here to protect us. And, those things matter. They really do. They may seem innocuous or something like that, but those things matter right there as well. I know some people say they're superfluous. They're not, because those are the positive mindsets, bases that you get early on that are imprinted on you. Right. And then you get to know and you trust and you work from there as well. And that's where, Doug, you have a point. This is where, community leaders like myself, Steve, and others, we've got to step in our own respective communities, because we're the ones that they look to. They're the ones that we make a difference. By lawyers, we're seen as leaders in their community. What are we doing to effectuate positive change? What are we doing for the activists? What are we doing to make sure they feel like they're heard? Because they're not out there because they feel like that, oh, everyone's listening to them. They're out there because they feel like, who's listening? What's going on here? What change will actually happen over here as well? I don't see change happening. Who's doing that? What are we doing to encourage that and work with that right there as well? So it's a positive effect as opposed to a negative effect in how things get done and change with that. Those are, and I know, these are big, heavy issues, right? These are big, heavy issues, big, heavy lifts. But another reason I felt compelled to take this position is because what we've been doing, what we've been talking about here. And I felt like, what? We're in a moment of true systemic change in our country. We're in a moment of reflection. What am I going to do? When am I going to look back in 20, 30, 40 years and say, what did I do to try to make a difference on these issues? And I felt like an obligation. I feel blessed. I feel blessed to be an attorney. I feel blessed to be chair of the African American State Bar. I feel blessed to live in the council member in the city of Pflugerville. I feel blessed to be able to know people on all different viewpoints. Just like what you said, Kevin, it's so perspective. Perspective is so key in having to solve issues, because you get to relate and understand various people. I've been blessed to be in a position like that, just like how Steve has been. So what are we doing to make a difference instead of just, what are we doing to put our money in our mouth as opposed to the limiting and saying, man, this sucks.
Robert, I was about to jump in when you made that point about the activist, or what are they going to consider to be a successful legislative session in Texas? And the answer is, if we pass a law that says every law enforcement agency will send their cops into the schools to say hi to the kids and let the kids pet the dogs, that's not going to be considered an effective use of the legislature's time by the Austin Justice Coalition or the Texas Justice Coalition. They're going to deem that an abject failure on the part of our elected officials. Now that might be a good program, and it might reap all kinds of benefits to us down the road. But right now, the legislature is faced with what I believe are some extremely unreasonable expectations about police reform that is supposed to solve societal problems.
Well, again, but again, I think some of this reform is reflected, as Rudy, I think, really mentioned, you're the effect. You're not the cause. The cause is coming from lack of economics, lack of you're the stopgap because it's not going well here economically and civilly. And then you say, well, here comes the unrest. You couple that with something you don't like, a bad officer, and now you do have a situation that becomes a national scenario. That's not necessarily the norm, but you're coming in, I think, at the point where most people think it's at the beginning to where things go. But I think the wrong turns have been made way up the road before they encounter law enforcement. And Rudy, I think what you brought out and how you said that depicts exactly why we're here, unfortunately, because the system is really adversely affected way before law enforcement.
And I agree with you partly, but this gets back to the conversation we were having with Senator West the other day. And that is that if we go into the legislative session and the legislature passes some really great public policy reforms, things that are just, that stand to actually have an enormous impact, there's a significant portion of our population that's not going to see that as success, at least not in the short term. So this has to be coupled with public information campaigns, with conversations at the local level, at the very, like Doug points out, in South Park and in Cloverleaf and in the 3rd Ward and the 4th Ward, there has to be conversations that talk about, look, here's what's really going on. Do we have racism in law enforcement? Sure, we got racism in society. Is it significantly, proportionately higher in law enforcement than the rest of our society? I doubt that very seriously. Racism is an issue to be dealt with in and of itself. It is not a law enforcement unique situation. So if we're going to focus only on law enforcement, we're not going to accomplish our objectives. If we focus on the underlying issues, we're not going to satisfy that percentage of our population that is expecting us to solve the problem by reforming law enforcement.
And Kevin, to that point, I think that this is I'll pull a Steve here. This is where key. So when we're talking about, for example, the Center for Elimination of Disproportionate and Disparate Treatment, we need TMPA support. We need the Houston Police Department support. We need the Dallas Police Department support. We need the state trooper support on that, because that helps to go ahead to address and look at those issues that are upstream that cause the things to come down over here with us as well. And so it's like, hey, listen, let's identify these things. What are we doing about healthcare? What are we doing about education? Why is it that a woman in Texas only gets postpartum care for 60 days under Medicaid? Why can't it be a year? Wait, what does that happen? Why are kids being kicked off Medicaid every 3 to 4 months that are just born? And what happens when you're kicked off of Medicaid? How are you able to get healthcare? If you're not able to get healthcare, how do you take care of your kids? What if you don't have a job? What are you able to do? I mean, all these things that create that circle. Those are the things where we need law enforcement support over there with that. At the same time, just like you said, addressing issues that are, true systemic change regarding law enforcement. We've talked about the training, how you said we need to make it ubiquitous across, because we don't. We have various standards right now. We got to talk about, hey, we have a database. Hey, so we actually have that, because you actually have that. So we need to tell the police chiefs, hey, by the way, you need to update this database because you have this tool. It's not being used. Therefore, consequently, people aren't aware of what's going on, these prior things where they're hiring these peace officers and these surveyors, things like that. So you're right. It has to be a two-pronged attack. And maybe the coolest thing that may come out of this phone call is that we're all working on the two-pronged attack. And it's not just different portions. It's saying, okay, listen, because why? In the end, it supports all of Texas, not just Black Texans, all Texans. Because remember, when you lift up Black Texans, you lift up all Texans in general with that as well. It makes society better for everybody. That's a really good point, Kevin.
I had a meeting the other day. Right? I had a meeting the other day with Senator John Whitmire. Y'all know John Whitmire. He was sitting there going, y'all aren't doing enough to get out there and help with this police reform. I said, do you even know what we do? He has no idea that we even have this meeting every week. He has no idea that we do all this other things. And I think for the most part, most people don't. Our select circles know about it, but we're going to have to do a better job of getting the full public, all law enforcement. We need to get people at the Capitol to understand what we're doing and know that we are working on this. We want a viable solution for everyone, but you can't just heap on all this stuff over here and go, oh, it's got to be this way, nothing else, because it's not going to work.
And Doug, I think the way that we help you is we reiterate your points to Senator Whitmire, Senator West, folks on the House, criminal jurisprudence committees and things of that nature. And we'll go to Tender Holt and say, listen, we did this. We've done some of the work as former staff and people that are continuing to interface with the elected officials. We have our own elected officials. I mean, we grabbed as much as we could publicly and in front of God and everyone to say, we're not ducking and dodging issues. We're looking for solutions. We have information that somewhere, some way, somehow, all of us didn't know or were on the same page that Texans had already done, had afforded. Where you can really help legislature is give us some standardization. Give us some funding for the training. Be damned about this defund and let people that they don't understand the issue. We're people that have worked in the Capitol in key positions. You know this. We're looking for solutions. You know this. We've put it out there and we're going to give you the information and all the research and time and effort that we've taken prior to the legislative year, and we give this to you. We've considered the Black chiefs of staff. We've considered the Texas NAACP. We've considered the African American lawyer section legislative platform. Now we have a gentleman who's the president and executive director from that. We need Kevin to show up, Doug to show up, Clay to show up. Now we show unity and a united front that we're serious about what we said, what we discussed, what we discovered, and what we are putting forth as solutions. You're the elected. Here it is. Now make it work.
And Stephen, to your point and to Doug's point earlier, when he was talking about the high crime areas that he worked and even grew up in, that's not something that's occurred overnight. It's been around 30, 40, 50 years. I was on a border assignment back in 14 and took down a car that had a 17-year-old high school student delivering a load of cocaine. And she's talking to the narcotics agent and she's basically telling him, what skill can I do to make this kind of money in La Jolla? She can. And that's her. This is not a new problem. It's been around forever. And it doesn't seem as though legislatively, we got to do more than just throw money at it. There's got to be a real course of action to cause that 17-year-old or to cause the person that Doug was talking about that he said should be an accountant to want to be an accountant and to do something other than criminal activity.
And that's going to be something that Rudy and I, as a section, we have to reach out. And we just can't look at it from a legal perspective. We have to say that there can be the accountants, the doctors, plumbers, technical jobs are highly sought because, as you mentioned, Rudy, there'll be a depletion of those things. But again,
have you used a plumber lately?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Did you know that the average age of a plumber now is close to 50? This is what our problem is. And you know how much they charge. I mean, this is what we're saying. Absolutely, that people don't know this, and this is what I get really frustrated about when we're talking about education, the lack thereof, and what we're doing in the service to these kids is that who's going to these schools, who's putting these programs in place, and in a lot of ways, this is here, perfect example. We're talking about education, right? They did education reform, finance reform, right? And now we found out it wasn't a sustainable model, so they got to figure out how to do it this session. What they did regarding education and trying to do, they called them reading readiness camps, and working for there has made a huge difference in the last 2 years in these several schools around there as well. What happens when you don't do these things? What happens when you don't fund these things? Again, they get diverted into what Clay and Doug are saying over here to other areas because you're just trying to make it. Most people are trying to make it. I know people may call me Pollyannish on this. I firmly believe most people are good and they want to see people do good. And they want to do good by the people about them. But are you giving them the tool sets, the skills, and the abilities to do so? And a lot of times in these low income, these black and brown neighborhoods, these communities right there as well, you haven't done that over generations, and it's become cyclical for these people. So what are you doing to help us to make sure these things don't happen further?
Okay, but I'm going to throw something at you, and since we're about to close up, this may be the end of it, and the whole thing about duty to intervene may have to wait for next week. But back in the early '90s, when I was working the gang unit, I met a young man who was 16 years old, and he and I sat and had a very frank conversation, and he was knocking down $5,000 a week selling crack cocaine. And he basically told me, you tell me another job that I can get into. You know, when I was growing up, people
Exactly.
they drilled into me, crime doesn't pay, crime doesn't pay, crime doesn't pay. Tell me how to convince that young man that crime doesn't pay. When you say we have to teach people to do good, to want to do good, we have to help them define what good is.
Right. Well, it's not a sprint. That journey isn't going to be, okay, you make 5,000 a week for a year and a half, and then you get dumped to the side because they're going to bring the next guy in because law enforcement now, again, and that goes upstream.
But in that moment, it's hard to convince a 16-year-old kid.
Well, it's hard to convince a 50-year-old man. Right. There's a song called "What People Do for Money," and towards the end of the song, the rapper says, "I did it for the M-O." You know, he asked him why, and he said, "I did it for the M-O-N-E-Y." It is about the finances, and we have to recognize, like Rudy and myself and everyone on this call, that we have a work and a life expectancy that we look at 40 years of a period or so, that will give us fulfillment, and then it'll pay off at the end in some sort of retirement. They don't see that. And I respect, listen, I have a cousin, and again, to be very transparent, my guy Fuzzy, he's a drug dealer because he knew he was making X a week. Wasn't a great student. Nobody really kept him on track. But again, the problem is now nowhere to be found. And in this over time, he didn't, we knew that there was going to be a stop, a hard stop. And that's the issue, because like Kevin says, when you're making 5 G's a week, life is good in Texas or wherever that person is. But we have to plan long term.
Speaking of keeping on track, we're now past 11 o'clock, so we're going to have to agree we'll be back again next week. By the way, I do want to point out for some of our younger audience, back in the early 90s, 5,000 a week was a lot of money. So
back then, I don't know what kind of jobs y'all have.
Hey guys, we really appreciate it, and we will.
Kevin, if you're worried about that, then we need to re-talk about your contract.
I don't have a contract, you know that.
and also, Kevin, you said the duty to intervene and a couple of other issues will be for next week. So, kind of want to preface that as well. But I know we do need to keep on task. Very great discussion. I'm still looking at previous accounts to see what we can come up with. And if I ask anybody else with the group to figure out what we can take out that we know will add to the solution that is agreed upon, and we can take to, folks like Senator West and the like, Whitmire, that we do and have come up with some things over the months that they certainly should seriously consider, because we have pretty much agreement across the board.
Exactly. Where we can agree, we agree. We disagree, we disagree, but we do so respectively and work with, work accordingly with that. That's how you get things done. That's how this great country was founded on. And if we don't continue a path like that, dude, we'll end up like Rome, just being blunt.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
we got next week.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We appreciate y'all. Have a great week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.